Morning, everyone.
Hi, Liz. Good to see you.
Hello.
Bob Woodruff.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
Been a while, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to be coming and going. We're doing a renovation here this morning, so I'll be zooming around the kitchen as in the bathroom as well as the meeting.
Okay.
Nice you could put this together.
It wasn't me. It was Dan and Ben. But
Uh-huh. Dan the man.
yeah. Morning, Louise. Bob, I think you've got some background noise going on there.
Is that too much for you? I wonder what I can do. Volume it down here somehow?
Yeah. Or you could mute and until you want to speak, maybe.
Yeah, okay. So I'm hearing you, but you're not hearing my workman in the 2 rooms away here.
Yeah.
See if I can find mute. Mute.
Ben, I'm just letting people in. You can take over whenever you
Yeah,
are ready.
I mean, I think we'll let everybody filter in. We might start a couple minutes late. I see for our guests, I see Chris Neal is here. I thought I saw Connor. And thought I saw Kevin Dodds.
I am on.
There's Kevin, Chris, Connor. So we're just missing Adam and David at this point.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yep, got you.
Perfect.
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right, I see David has joined us, and so we're just waiting on Adam. Let's see if I can send him a text.
It's only remote, virtual meetings. I was just wondering, there's nothing in the organization that suggests that the town has to uniform to the village across all boards. Right, but I mean, even if it doesn't require the hybrid, the legislation allowing, it doesn't allow.
Liz, can you sort of make sure that you're muting anybody that's background noise? I think there's one
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
We're just waiting on Adam Moore at this point. We'll give him another couple minutes.
Hello?
Yes, hello.
Hi,
Somebody
it's
on a-
Adam Moore.
Hi, Adam. Okay.
Sorry I'm on the phone. My board of directors is still using my Zoom account, so I can't zoom in and see you until they're done. But when they start walking out of the building, I will zoom in properly.
Okay. Well, why don't we get started and we can and you can just keep going on the phone until that point.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So this is not a regular Climate Action Task Force meeting. And for those that aren't familiar, the Climate Action Task Force was established in 2019, I guess. I'm going to say 2019 at this point. And it's a collaboration between the Martha's Vineyard Commission and other stakeholders around the island looking at climate change resilience, climate change adaptation, and energy mitigation. And we've tried to discuss topics that we see coming towards the island that haven't had airtime to be properly discussed in other forums. And we've used the task force to help guide sort of the climate actions of the island. We've developed now a climate action plan. We've done some energy modeling on the island, but we're also intimately looking at our natural systems in the island and the MVC. You know, the MVC is first tasked with really protecting a lot of these natural systems and the environment and the uniqueness of these environments. And when we think about the changes that climate change is bringing forward, it's going to affect not just the humans that are on the island, but the natural environment of our island. And so, you know, understanding how we live with that, how we manage that, and how we also just let those systems act as they should act and can act in response to climate change is important to understand. And so, you know, everybody I think on this call is aware that our beech trees are under threat from different sort of vectors. Our pine trees are under threat from different sort of vectors. Some of these things are natural systems that have occurred for millions of years. Some of them are new to this area as the climate changes. And so I think everybody is also aware that, you know, we have the southern pine beetle that has sort of come to the fro as well, and is affecting both, you know, indigenous stands of trees and our backyards. And sorry about that. So we've gathered a group of what I would say are real experts on these topics to help us as an island understand what are the best practices that we can move forward with if we're thinking about the management of not just those wild stands of trees that we appreciate, but even what's happening in our own backyards and in the more managed landscapes. And so today we have five guests that we've invited. Dr. David Foster, who's the director of Harvard Forest, or the former director of Harvard Forest. Adam Moore, who is our executive director at the Sheriff's Meadow Foundation. Christopher Neal, who's a senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. Connor Laffey, who is the superintendent for the state forest. And Kevin Dodds, who's the U.S. Forest Service entomologist. And so I'm just going to go in that same order. They can introduce themselves and then give sort of a brief statement about, how they're seeing things from an island perspective. And then we'll get into a little bit of a discussion amongst them. And then if people have questions or thoughts, I would say, raise your hand, chime in. I think we can be a little informal on this. It's a Zoom meeting. So I hope that we can have sort of a broad discussion around sort of what's happening here, what should we anticipate is happening in the future, and how do we approach it through best management practices from, very intensive practices to do nothing practices and everything in between. And so why don't we kick it off with Dr. David Foster? Why don't you give a quick introduction, and then we'll go down through the list. So thank you.
Hey, thanks, Ben. And thanks for everybody on the Climate Action Task Force and others who are here. Yeah, I completely agree. This is a really important topic, and our natural environment and our natural communities do an awful lot more than just provide the backdrop to our lives on the vineyard. And they offer an awful lot to people, both directly and indirectly. And as Ben just said, they're a critical part of supporting a wide range of organisms and the vitality of the vineyard natural systems. If the intent is to kind of look at major threats and then focus in specifically at the current issues that are arising with invasive kind of insects and pathogens, let me just give a couple of perspectives. And my background on these topics, specifically on the vineyard, is that we've been doing research out here for about 20 years, looking at everything from the really deep history of the landscape and the way the vegetation and landforms have changed, and also tried to look kind of very intensively at the forests, their distribution, their age structure, and their dynamics over a long period of time. And that work has been largely led and collaborated with many other people, but largely led by people working at the Harvard Forest, in particular, Dave Orwig and Brian Hall, who have helped a lot with kind of looking at old forests and looking at the age structure of our forests. So I think, the biggest threat to the vineyard is land use. I won't say much more about that, but, we are regularly making our natural forests and our natural environment smaller on a regular basis. We are deforesting, we are clearing areas, whether it's for solar development or it's for new horse fields or it's for a variety of residential and commercial activities. That's the biggest threat. And there's a big role to be played at the town level and at the MVC level in trying to address that. In terms of other dynamics, it doesn't get much mention very frequently, but the vineyard is due for a major and catastrophic hurricane. And this landscape hasn't experienced one of really great significance since the 80s and really the 50s. But if we look at the deep history of time, we can see the potential for storms like that to hit the island and to reconfigure it substantially, both in terms of the coastline and in terms of the dynamics of our forests. Our forests on the vineyard are at as an greatest extent and the oldest age that they have been for 300 years. After European settlement, there was a substantial amount of harvesting and clearing of the land. And the forests that we have now are a combination of old woodlots that were oftentimes very intensively managed, but were continuously forested We tend to call those ancient forests because they have kind of continuity through time. And then there are these secondary forests, which are really quite widespread, that have come in on all the old agricultural lands. It's very important to understand those differences, and I won't go into them now, but in terms of thinking about the value of our forests and the way they respond to different disturbances, that historical difference is important. In terms of invasive pests and pathogens, and any other kinds of stresses on our forests, I guess I always take a very strong stance towards great conservatism in terms of the way that we respond. The forests of the vineyard are not being managed very actively. We have very few people who are actually cutting forests, either to produce, say, cordwood, or to produce even fewer producing timber. But there is a great tendency to want to manage our forests for a whole host of other reasons, including health and future viability in the face of climate change, and in response to or in anticipation of disturbances by introduced or even native pests and pathogens. I think that can be warranted, but I think it should only be pursued when we really have very strong scientific insights to guide us on that, and where we have a history of information coming from that kind of management elsewhere. And I'm sure we'll hear from Kevin Dodds, who has great experience with this, about some of the examples along those lines. I would just point out that when it comes to our forests, they really are they are unique. They are distinctive forests. They're not like forests in most other places. They're not even like most forests in coastal areas. We have some remarkably old forests. We have, pitch pine forests that are dominated by trees that are 175 to 200 years of age, that have no stumps in them. They show no evidence of land use, even though they clearly do have a land use history. They are widely spaced forests. That is, the trees are widely spaced because the trees are so large. So before we actively manage in forests like that, or in any of our forests, I just think we should exert as much caution, use as much background information, and draw on the kind of expertise that is peppered all across this screen today. So I think, as an introductory remark, that's plenty from me. Thanks.
Great. Yes, thank you, David. Adam Moore.
Hi, and hopefully I'll zoom in normally in a moment or two. But first of all, thank you, Ben, for the invitation, and thanks to the Climate Action Committee for the invitation and for your interest in forest and forestry. I think this is terrific. So I'm really happy to be here today. I'll just speak briefly. Sheriff's Meadow Foundation is responsible for over 2,000 acres of property across the island that we own. And I'm a licensed forester, so I have a special interest in the care of the forests on these property, and most of them are forested. We're taking two different approaches to two different insects, or one's not an insect, two different creatures that we see in the forest today. One of them is the nematode, which is causing the cause of the beech leaf disease, and the other is the southern pine beetle, which is affecting pitch pines. And one is very passive with beech leaf disease. We're sad to see what seems to be happening to many of the beeches here, but we're taking a very passive approach. We don't know what to do. We don't understand the disease very well. We don't want to do anything chemical in the forest, and we don't want to go in and cut the trees down and take any active steps. We would if there were a safety threat to if we're on the trail and the tree was dying and about to fall, or creating some other kind of hazard, that's different. But in general, we're taking a very passive approach to beech leaf disease. We're taking a more active approach to southern pine beetle, and that is based on science and studies that have been done by people in this field on what are approaches you can take with southern pine beetle. There are a couple of good examples where you could see what we're doing, and I'm happy to walk any of you through it or answer questions on the phone. And we've got a guided walk tomorrow at 10 a.m. at West Top Woods. You're all invited to attend. We'll lead more in the months and years to come. But one example is at the Phillips Preserve. We have a forest cutting plan being implemented right now. That property is closed to the public at the moment because of this. But we just discovered an outbreak of the southern pine beetle last year. We did a suppression cutting that still wasn't sufficient, and now we're doing an expanded suppression effort and also a thinning of the forest that would make it more resilient to preserve those better trees, the more mature ones, over time, and that's what we hope we can do. And I'm in the middle of writing 4 forest stewardship plans for West Chop Woods, Phillips Preserve, Caroline Tuttle Preserve, and the Reynolds property, which is off of Meeting House Way down in Edgartown. And ultimately, we want to keep forests as forests. And whether they're old forests or whether they're young forests, I agree that that's imperative for us. So those are my opening comments, and I'll try to zoom in now, and thank you, and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Adam.
Welcome.
Chris Neal.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to, yeah, those were great introductions by David and Adam, and thanks, Ben, for organizing this. So I just want to add a couple of points from my perspective. I'm an ecologist, and I think about watersheds and the role that land use plays in watershed processes that is influencing soils, but also waters. And I think one of the benefits that David talked about, which was forests play a extremely important role in maintaining water quality. And we know our estuaries have an enormous nitrogen pollution problem, and forests are key to managing that and mitigating nitrogen loading to estuaries. They also play a big role in carbon storage, a little bit less on the vineyard because our forests aren't as big and don't store quite as much carbon as other places, but that's important on a regional basis. And there are ways of managing forests to increase carbon storage, which are mainly doing exactly what David and Adam are talking about, and that is let forests grow. We know from science that's gone on at places like the Harvard Forest that these forests of this age are still socking away large amounts of carbon, right? They're not old and decrepit in the sense that their growth rates have declined a great deal, so they're still storing large amounts of carbon. I've worked on the vineyard for a long time on some habitats that are non-forest, that is grasslands and shrublands. And one of the things I'm very interested in is trying to think about how we balance the preservation of some non-forest disturbance-dependent habitats like grasslands and shrublands that support an enormous and disproportionate amount of biodiversity in the coastal region, and especially in a place like the vineyard. There are lots and lots of rare species that occur in non-forest lands. They don't occupy a big area, so I think there's room for thinking about how you sustain those habitats while regrowing forests and while saving forests. But just I want to make sure that stays on the radar. One of the things my research team has been doing recently, and it's based on work that David and his colleagues, Glenn Motzkin, did more than 20 years ago, and that is they resurveyed lots and lots of natural areas on the vineyard for plant diversity, and they also measured trees, so we can look at the carbon stocks 22 years ago and now. But one of the things we're observing is that biodiversity, that is plant diversity, is declining across the forested and the non-forested habitats of the vineyard. It's one of the great values that comes from carefully documenting work done a long time ago, so it can be repeated and you can look at these changes over time. But we're interested in that. We don't think we understand it extremely well. It might have something to do with climate. It might have something to do with, say, expanded deer abundance, which are, hitting some plants harder than others. So there are a lot of things about how forests are changing that we still don't understand. But the monster in the room right now are these very fast moving changes like southern pine beetle, and especially this beech leaf disease. I work some with the research team at Hubbard Brook, which is another long-term study like the one that David ran for many, many years in Petersham and Hartwood Forest. And in 1997, 95% of the beech trees were classified as healthy. But by 2002, and this is before beech leaf disease is hitting in the woods of northern New Hampshire, 1997, 95% of the forest, of the beech in the forest, was classified as healthy. In 2022, only 38% was healthy. And that's because of the fact that beech bark disease was already here and stressing trees. And I think that the thing that keeps me up at night in terms of the future of forests is these interacting stresses. What will happen when beech leaf disease hits a forest that's already under stress from other factors, including in the case of beech, which is I think in some ways our worst nightmare coming to roost here. It is interacting with drought, and so climate is this overlay on top of this. And I know David's watched this occur in places on the vineyard where you had defoliation coupled with drought. All of a sudden, you get tree mortality when defoliation alone or drought alone might not cause that mortality. So I'm very interested to think about what Kevin thinks about these emerging threats, but I think we have to better understand the future of these interacting stresses on forests and figure out what is that going to make our forests look like in the future. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to participate in the discussion.
Great, thank you, Chris. Connor.
Good morning. I'm Connor Laffey, Superintendent Manual Corella State Forest. I'll focus on the state forest. We've been monitoring for southern pine beetle for the past 9 years now. We've seen some individual beetles show up in our traps over the past couple of years. This past year was the first year that we saw mortality of any trees. In August was whenever we confirmed an outbreak in the forest, and so far we've found southern pine beetle in 3 areas in the forest. 2 of those areas are pretty close, probably about just a couple hundred yards apart. The other one is about a half-mile away. They're all pretty far interior in the forest, which is interesting that they would show up more so in the middle rather than on the perimeter. But we found about 100 infested trees, and to try to mitigate that damage, we cut down those infected trees also with a buffer, which is pretty standard as far as trying to deal with the infestation. So we probably cut down close to about 200 trees. I think that was in September, maybe early October too. And obviously we're going to monitor it for it as close as we can this year. Hopefully that stems a good amount, but considering how quickly it's moving, especially on the, around the Phillips Preserve, I'm assuming that we'll find it back in the forest at some point soon, even if it's from different infestations elsewhere on the island. So it's definitely something that we're going to have to be handling for looks like for the foreseeable future. It's something we're just going to be dealing with. I'd say that so far it's affected about a dozen acres in the forest. Obviously that number can grow. And unfortunately, it seems like two of the areas were in very nice, pristine forest. The density was good. The trees looked really healthy beforehand. But it moved through there pretty quickly and killed those trees what would appear to be a single growing season. So yeah, it's definitely an alarming thing to keep an eye on. And hopefully we can figure out a way to, mitigate it as best as possible.
Great. Thank you, Connor. And lastly, Kevin Dodds.
Hi, everybody. I really appreciate the invitation to speak today. And because I haven't interacted with a lot of you, I'll just really briefly just cover my background. I'm a forest entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service in Durham, New Hampshire. I work for state and private and tribal forestry. And in that role, I provide technical assistance across New England and New York. And so we cover a really large area. I've been here about 20 years now, worked on a lot of different invasive species, mostly wood-boring beetles and bark beetles, but also I have some familiarity with some of the invasive defoliators like that have affected your area, like spongy moth now and winter moth as well. So I've been here for 20 years, really covered a lot of a lot of area over that time. The last decade, which is kind of crazy to me already, it's been 10 years that we've been dealing with southern pine beetle on Long Island. And over that time, we've seen consistent outbreak populations where, we're looking at about 5,000 to 7,000 acres of damage per year down there. We've had a high of 20,000 acres, and that's not all mortality, but that's area that's affected by the beetle. And so, it's a very, very aggressive insect. It's not like anything else that we have in the area. And so I think of it as a beetle or an insect that's not really to be toyed with. If you have areas that you're very concerned about, that you want to maintain in pitch pine, you really have to start sequencing through the options, whether that's proactive and doing some thinnings, or if you are not ahead of the game on that, reactive, which is going in like what's occurring now and cutting down trees and trying to suppress those populations. But David brought up some great points about that, like certainly pitch pine does not exist in one forest type or one structure or anything like that. And so there's stands that are going to be very susceptible, and those would be these high density overstock stands, and then stands that have a lower percentage of pitch pine in there that may be okay. But even saying that, we've found on Long Island that the pattern that you see with outbreaks up here does not form the exact same scenario as what you see in the Southeast. And so, for example, we had some stands on Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge and some other federal lands on Long Island that, I had experience with southern pine beetle in the South. I went into these stands and I thought, these aren't, populations probably won't build in here. There's large diameter pitch pine. They're very spread out throughout the stand, not, we're looking at trees probably 50 meters or more apart. And in the South, that wouldn't sustain an infestation, but up here, all of those trees were attacked and killed by southern pine beetle. So, we have a fairly good sense of, how the beetle's behaving up here, but it is also very different too. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that we might look at a stand and think that it's low susceptibility, but the next year that stand may get attacked and you may lose some of those trees. And so over the past couple of years, we've been focusing more on, we're still hoping that we can protect stands and all of that, but the key for us, especially on Long Island, where there's been no management whatsoever since stand initiation, we're looking at really at restoration, right? And you have this giant mismatch between what the forest is in the overstory versus the understory. And you go into these forests, there's absolutely no pitch pine in the understory, no regen, no saplings, no nothing. And so southern pine beetle comes in, kills the overstory pitch pine, and then that results in a complete conversion of forest type. And so in some areas that may be okay, but if you want to maintain pitch pine, this is kind of the time to start thinking about, well, what happens if we do lose our overstory? Are we going to have, do we want to have pitch pine present? And then if you do, then this is the time to really start putting in some restoration treatments that may or may not involve overstory removal. It probably will, but it certainly, leads to the discussion of prescribed fire, understory treatments, and things like that. So, but yeah, so it is, I think we've had this discussion a lot of times with folks outside of Long Island where there's a, well, how bad will it be? And I think with southern pine beetle, it's always good to look at it as it'll be worse than what you expect, because it really does come in fast. Connor just mentioned the changes that occurred in just one summer, in one summer on Long Island, and on an 80-acre stand that had larger diameter trees, there was 98% mortality in there, and we lost something like close to 10,000 trees. So it's a serious issue. But again, I understand where David's coming from too. You may look at your forest, and if you have good information on structure, density, and all that, you very well could prioritize that landscape, and some areas should be treated, others maybe not. So I think that's probably a good kind of intro to my angle on all of this and my background a little bit. So I look forward to discussing this with everybody.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. I mean, obviously, this is a subject matter that we know some about, but we know what we don't know, and we don't even know what we don't know, right? So there's a mixed understanding. And I always sort of reflect on, these species that we've been talking about, whether it's the tree or the organisms that are, using the tree for resources, have been on this planet for a long time and have been interacting with each other for a long time. And forests still exist. And I also just think about forest succession and how do forests, sort of develop over time, how do resources get deployed within the forest over time. From a dying tree is providing resources for the next generation, and sort of the natural world manages this. Of course, we've sort of added this layer of climate change that is changing the way the natural world manages itself or sort of works within itself. Is there, and then, albeit my very brief sort of review of what's out there for the literature on how do we manage these things, it seems a lot of it comes out of the forestry industry, where we're seeing forests not for a natural system that supports broad biodiversity, but as potentially a cash crop of sorts. And so a lot of the studies are focused on how do you protect that asset versus how do you understand sort of the successional nature of a forest, the die off, the growth. How are the internal sort of resources of the forest distributed from the soil to the canopy, and over time, and in that sense, are we too quick potentially to feel like as a human species we need to interact with the natural world when we see abrupt change, but these abrupt changes have occurred in the past, and I don't know if there's a question in there more than sort of a polemical statement about, what does it mean when we interact and manage the forest versus allowing the forest to manage itself, even if it feels sort of like, wow, all the pitch pines have died, what comes next? It might not come back in your lifetime. It might come back, beyond your own lifetime. So help me better understand sort of that relationship. And,
Sure.
sort of the do nothing versus the sort of like we need to mechanically manage these spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are all good points. One of the things to keep in mind with bark beetles especially is I don't want to say they're a corrective force, but where they have become problems is generally because we have either done something or not done something, right? And so in the Southeast, where, you mentioned some of the literature coming out of more, corporate or, land management areas. Those were forests that changed over time and became, because of human interactions, became more dominated more by loblolly pine, a very susceptible tree species. So, as those forests grew up, they were not managed. Fire was suppressed. Disturbances were not as common. And so again, you formed this, background of habitat that wasn't there, before that period because, the forests were just, they were growing. There was natural disturbance. Southern pine beetle was picking off trees, but maybe not forming these massive infestations. And up here, it's kind of the opposite, right? So there hasn't been in pitch pine, it's not that there's been this conversion because of going towards more commercial forestry or anything like that, but there's been suppression of disturbances. And so you look at a forest now that, there's not been fire in a lot of these areas, or there's just now reintroduction of fire. And so the stands aren't in a place where they're going to absorb this type of a disturbance, in my opinion, and so, well, they'll absorb it. It's just a matter, again, if you want to keep pitch pine in those forest types, right? And so, on Long Island, where we had all of the pitch pine killed off, there's still forest there. It's an oak dominated forest now with some red maple and gum is in there. And so, you still have something there, and that may be okay for the areas that you're talking about. So I think it's, we do have a good understanding of what drives a lot of bark beetle population dynamics. We don't often have a good idea of what starts the problem, and I would say even that with southern pine beetle, we don't even really fully understand why an infestation starts anywhere, but we do understand that once an infestation starts, how the beetle is going to behave in those areas. And so, in a way, it's an easy, it's an easy-ish approach, to say, okay, that's there's a stand that if you get beetles, there's going to be damage. And then, but you're right, it's up to the owners and the managers of those properties and the communities around there to decide, well, what type of forest do you want going forward? Pitch pine or pitch pine barren structure is not that important. And you want to go towards, higher levels of carbon or something, then there can be shifts there. But also, Chris mentioned, defoliators and beech leaf disease. And I'm with you, Chris, in terms of this sort of additive impact of disturbances. And we've seen, recent outbreaks of spongy moth that we saw mortality that levels that we've never seen. You've got different defoliators that defoliate trees at different times of years now, and some of those are exotic, so you can have a tree relief and get hit by the next species. You've got drought conditions, you have fungal diseases, so there's a lot of pressure on the forest, and in my opinion, and my training is bark beetle ecology and management, but also forest ecology, and I just worry that a total hands-off approach would really threaten a lot of areas.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's go David and then Adam. I saw your hand go up. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, thanks. Kind of one observation and then a question for Kevin. So the observation, it's already been stated that pitch pine exists in a lot of different situations and conditions across the island. It's also important to recognize that some large percentage, and I don't have the numbers, but I would say somewhere between 10 and 25% of the pitch pine that's on the island was actually planted, or is the regeneration that has come from planted areas. And if you, for example, drive down the bottoms towards the South Shore, you'll see lots of areas of pure pitch pine. And because the trees have grown up and have been battered by wind and there's lots of different things affecting them, they actually look very natural. And very seldom are they in discrete rows, although you do see that in many places. So we have very dense, kind of pure pitch pine, some of which is planted on what were cleared areas, old fields and so on. And then we have naturally established pitch pine on old fields. And we have pitch pine on these old woodlands, some of which are, magnificent and large. So I think I certainly wouldn't, I agree with Kevin, I wouldn't at all ascribe a complete hands-off approach. I think that what we need to do is to look very strongly at the variation. So for Kevin, I guess one of the questions I have is to play this out kind of over the long term, 20 years or 50 years. And if we have two situations, we pick up on what Connor was talking about in the state forest, where you have a lot of actually some very dense areas of younger pitch pine. You also do have some areas of older pine. And we contrast that with some place like West Chop Woods, where you have these, up to 200-year-old pitch pines and a mosaic of pine and oak that is widely spaced. How do you envision this playing out in the long term? If, for example, we have infestations in the state forest in these denser areas, and we go in and we cut all the dead trees and some of the surrounding trees, and we're trying to kind of control that particular infestation. What does that do relative to, I mean, I can imagine if we just left that it would spread out from there and so on. But do we expect in the next 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, that we're just going to continue to get these pockets of infestation, and that ultimately an awful lot of the forest will in fact get pitch pine, get southern pine beetle and suffer the same way? And I guess to contrast that kind of denser, very expansive forest area with a place where you've got these scattered trees, there is mortality happening from southern pine beetle in this old forest. But because the trees are widely spaced or in clumps and so on, it's clumps of trees that are dying. And again, if we left that or if we manage that, how might that play out differently?
Sure. So, my guess going forward in the state lands, especially if we, if we stick with this pattern that we're seeing with our winter temperatures now, we are just not getting, if we would just get a few nights, sub-zero, and, even 5 Fahrenheit below gets us 80%, mortality of the brood in trees. And that would really be key. I mean, my hope this winter was that we would get some of those severe cold days. And even up here in New Hampshire, we haven't had any of those. So I'm sure down there it's been very mild for the most part too. That's our, so if we live in this world, which I think makes sense going forward, that we're going to have fewer and fewer of those, then you can expect southern pine beetle activity. There's some natural predators that can help, limit populations to some degree, but once you get a population area, in my opinion, it's really, you want to switch, especially where you have higher density stands, into being proactive and thinning. And that would at least give the chance in those areas to not build populations. And that's the key, because then I think you'd be protecting these other forests, David, that you were mentioning with the lower density trees, because southern pine beetle is a weird beetle in that its behavior is seasonal, right? And so in the spring, it's in a dispersal mode. And so it's coming out of the previous year's trees. It's got fat, lipids to fly. It won't even respond to pheromones until it flies. And so it flies, it burns off some fat, it randomly starts attacking trees. Then it releases pheromones, and then an infestation grows from that original tree in that area. for the most part in the southeast, then the beetle doesn't disperse all summer. You get a small percentage that go searching, but you don't see a lot of spot new infestations grow through the summer. So really doing anything to kind of limit, that source of beetles would be beneficial. But honestly, we're in a new world too, right? Like I don't know the answer that if you thin, if you thin and protect as best you can the higher density areas, that also protects these stands that have maybe more unique structure and larger trees. The problem too with larger trees, if southern pine beetle does find it and does successfully attack it, they produce a lot of brood. And then you have a focal tree or a couple trees that are producing a lot of brood that are going out and flying. And there's a lot of stuff we don't have any evidence for. My sense in Long Island and compared to the Southeast is, in the Southeast, you have a lot of forest to absorb a lot of beetles. On Long Island, it's a matrix of landscape, right? Of a landscape. And so you've got a lot of urban areas, you have hardwood forests, you have barrens, you have high density pitch pine. So beetles that develop in that pitch pine, they may disperse out, but they very well could just end up coming back because there's not, they can fly fairly well. They fly out, don't get any sensory stimulus from host volatiles or anything. And so I just wonder if we're seeing like a less of a dispersal pattern because of our landscapes, and so that we're going to see more and more impact in fewer stands. But compared to what you see in the Southeast where beetles can just go out. And so that's, I guess, what tying this back to your question. I still think, those other stands that you would maybe not do any management in. And I agree with that those stands that have a low density, you think about those in a different way than the high density stands. But I do feel like on an island where there'd be the potential of building populations, just some random spillover and attacks on those trees could threaten them.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Adam, jump in.
All right, thank you. Just a couple of comments and to Ben's question, and then to David's and Kevin's points. First of all, I think the long-term view is the appropriate view. We do have to take a look across generations of time. You're dealing with trees, not people, and our short lifetimes don't matter. On the other hand, the southern pine beetle has a very, very short lifetime, and the warmer it is, the shorter its life is, and they love that. They love pitch pines. They love it here just like we do, and they love killing pitch pines. That's what I learned. They are like an angel of death when they come into the forest and get a head of steam going. So it's humbling, and we ought to be humble in front of this force of nature. Just my experience with them, I'm learning as I go. So I'm learning every day. At the Phillips Preserve last summer, we saw them at about half an acre. Nicole Kelleher, the DCR Forest Health biologist, came out to see it, confirmed it was southern pine beetle. She said, it's kind of funny. This stand is not very dense. It's not a dense pitch pine. We have some large mature trees. And they wiped us out over there. So you can drive down Army Road now and see the clearing we have. And if you look towards the north, all the treetops are either barren or red. And the red ones are the ones that are in the process of dying. And when I was trying to do the suppression work last summer, I'd mark the trees, come back the next day, said, how did I forget that? And then I marked that tree. Then we came back the next day. And we said, how did we miss that tree? Well, I didn't miss it. They were just moving 10 feet every day. And one night they jumped 100 feet and we just said, Uncle, they're out and off and running. And what they do is they time their broods. They time the emergence of eggs. They have mass attacks. They cannot reproduce unless they kill the tree. So that's the only way they make more southern pine beetles. It's incredible. And we might say, well, that doesn't make sense to kill your host, but we're not making the rules here. This is a creature that's been doing this for a long, long time. So it's very humbling. That's a good approach to it. At West Chop Woods, come tomorrow. We'll talk about it in person. But there are indeed old, magnificent trees there. They're beautiful. I wrote about one for the MV Times a couple of years ago, like speculating on the life of the tree, and I cored it. That was probably like 150 years old, and David's done more. But there are also trees there that aren't magnificent that we could thin out. And my hope there is by thinning giving more space to the older, larger, more significant trees, we can maybe help them to survive the southern pine beetle that is going to affect them, and also get some regeneration on the ground so that in 200 years, not in our lifetime, but 200 years, there'll be some mature, magnificent pitch pines that have learned to live with the southern pine beetle, because they are our newest island resident and they're here to stay. So it's definitely not a cash crop. I wish it were a cash crop. It does affect industrial timberlands down south, but that's not what we're dealing with here. We are, for Sheriff's Meadow, where we are cutting trees, we're sawing the wood. We're interested if there's a community project in need of pitch pine timber, lumber, we're happy to supply that. We're also keeping in mind, we're in a neighborhood. We're not in the, not in northern Maine, and we have suburban house lots and people living.
No, yeah, I'm at the house.
Oh, sorry.
Stupid meeting.
We're mindful of wildfire risk and hazards, and the prospect of dead trees falling on people. That's something we're factoring into it. I've done some work on Nantucket on this, and they have a good presentation from the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, Nantucket Land Bank. They have a YouTube video. You can probably find it on either their website. So if you want some good entomology information, hear what they're doing, take a look at their YouTube video on this. They've done a nice job, and it's definitely from a conservation perspective, not from an industry perspective. So, but please take a look. Thanks, Ben.
All right, thank you, Adam.
Yeah.
You brought up another topic that we hadn't really touched on yet, is the danger of fire, and that's something that the island has started looking at much more closely, given the potential for prolonged droughts that we didn't experience as much in the past. In the sense of okay, the tree dies and it's in the forest and it regenerates the forest soil through that death. If we're removing the wood, you're removing that resource from the forest, but we're also potentially going to be removing resources from the forest because of the fire, the issue with fire and the amount of fuel that is potentially laying on the ground. Is there anything that we should know or understand around letting the forest die and regenerate versus removing the material from both a soil perspective and a fire risk perspective?
Well, why don't I start, but then there are more knowledgeable people on this talk than I. It kind of depends on the forest, what kind of trees, what happened there. Oak forest, I don't see as a big risk unless it's a scrub oak barrens, and we try to manage those, and the island's pretty good about that. Pitch pine forests, if they're dense or if there's a lot of piled up dead branches with pine needles, that could be a big risk. But just a standing dead pine tree is not really a fire risk if it's unless there's a whole lot of them and there's other sources of ignition. So it depends on a lot of different factors as to whether it's a risk. But there definitely are some risks. There's a community-wide fire plan, but not every forest is the same. And I think that's the key. It is sort of site specific, and it can change over time depending on what's done in the forest. But others might have more to offer than I do.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Unless anybody wants to touch on that topic, is there anybody that has another question? I do see a hand up. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. It comes in as
sorry. My name is Ken Carloni. Let me lower my hand. I'm a forest ecologist from Oregon, although I grew up in New England. And one of the things that I see, kind of an opportunity really that I see here, is that as from a historical perspective, hardwood forests were more dominant on the island than the pine forests, and of course the Connor's forest there was more or less an artificial forest, as you all know, that was planted during the WPA years. But I see an opportunity for Martha's Vineyard to move some of those stands that are in pine forest now back into hardwood forests to reduce that fire risk, and also to encourage more of that classic New England hardwood forest that has been, converted over the last century or so. Well, 4 centuries really, but specifically in the last century or so into pine forests. And so there's an opportunity to look at the areas that were traditionally more of the oak and beech and chestnut back in the day dominated forests, and that to the question of fuels, Maggie Craig, who's also on the call, and Dan Doyle from the Martha's Vineyard Commission, we've been working on a project to convert waste biomass that would be hazardous fuel on the floor from logging projects. Adam mentioned converting some of the pine into lumber, but regardless, what's going to happen with all of that fuel down on the forest floor being able to carry fire? And so Maggie, who's a fellow with the Martha's Vineyard Vision Fellowship, and I and a couple of other folks have been working on a project to convert that slash into char and add it back to the soil. So some of you may be familiar with biochar, the concept that when you char wood, you sequester that carbon, improves aeration in the soil, improves nutrient holding capacity, improves the habitat for beneficial microbes in the soil. So it has a lot of advantages there. And being able to go through some of these stands that are being actively managed to reduce the fuels, rather than just hauling all that stuff to Keene or letting it sit on the ground and be a potential fire hazard. If we can convert that to char, we can actually improve soil productivity in those areas, and maybe tip that the balance back toward the original hardwood forest. So that's a thought there that we might want to consider.
All right, thank you, Ken. Let's go Marie Larson and then Fred Hancock.
Yeah, this is actually Lillian Robinson sitting in with Marie Larson, and I'm a member of the Tisbury Conservation Commission, but I have a question about something which hasn't been mentioned yet, which is how much of a risk does the Asian jumping worm pose to the soil in our oak forests? I'm really concerned about that. That is, over 30 years ago, there were articles in the Boston Globe about the threat that the European earthworm posed to soils in hardwood forests. And now we've had an explosion of Asian jumping worms at Martha's Vineyard. And I think it's mostly from the landscaping industry here, bringing in a lot of potted plants from off island. And I'm just wondering, have the island ecologists noticed any kind of effect so far, and off island ecologists as well, effects on the soil in the forest from the Asian jumping worms?
Anybody have an answer for that one? Well, we might have to. Yes, Chris.
I don't really know the answer, but we could certainly, there are groups of people who are working on the questions of the impacts of earthworms. They have quite dramatic effects on the forest floor and forest understory plants. I'm not an expert on their effects, but we could certainly point you in, towards some of that research.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I would imagine we're going to raise a lot of questions that we're not going to be able to answer today. So we'll keep a list of those and see if we can get to some of those in the future. Fred, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to thank Ben and Liz and everybody else who organized this. I think it's a terrific forum. My question was, are there lessons to be learned from the gall wasp infestation that we had? I don't know how long ago it was now. I think probably 6 or 8 years ago, and it sort of burned itself out, I guess. And is there any danger of that pest coming back again?
Anybody want to take that one on?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll go Adam first and then Kevin.
I'm not worried about it at all. Essentially what happened was there was a the insect world is amazing. There was another, I think, wasp or something else that preyed on the gall wasp, and that stamped out the infestation. Did kill a fair number of black and scrub oaks along the way, but that's just natural, and I'm not worried about that.
I can say from Polly Hill's perspective, it was always around, and it's not as intense as it was, but it's always been on the vineyard. And what's happened, it exploded, and that's kind of part of the story of what's going on, where you have an insect kind of out of sync, or whatever kept it under control is not present, like a parasitoid, so it explodes. And part of it, Kevin, we learned about the Crip gall wasp is it really started 5 to 7 years prior to arriving here on Long Island. I think we can look towards Long Island as a warmer place that's warmer before we become warmer, that you'll see some of these things happening and then repeated on the vineyard. I have just one other topic to just interject in. I really appreciate this forum. I think it should happen more often. And thank you for putting it together. I also am concerned about soils and how they're changing. And we do see pockets, we get called to different places where shoestring root rot, armillaria, is kind of created like big dead zones of white oak, which is kind of interesting. So there are pockets of that. I think that's related to stress. So I think it'd be good as part of this moving forward to map these different zones where armillaria is kind of increasing. And that's another thing that's always been present. It's widespread, but it just increases with this kind of all the changes that are happening. So that, and then, it's going to talk to David separately and everybody else about trying to see how mycorrhizae are affected, kind of like what will happen to mycorrhizae in the future, how, what's their importance as kind of the quality of our rainwater changes, the acidity of it, the nitrogen. So how will that impact kind of the fungal root relationship? So maybe over time, these different vegetation zones try to build up what they call mycorrhizae profiles, what's there. And oftentimes they're the key to sustaining growth of trees. Not always, but they're certainly part of it. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Kevin, did you want to jump in on that question as well?
Pretty much what I was going to say was covered. I mean, those gall wasps are really very cyclic, and so you may get an outbreak of a few years and then not see anything for, a decade or more. I think in Long Island and maybe in other parts of Massachusetts, there was some activity coupled with drought. And so there was more of an impact on some of the trees. And I also think there was can't remember if it was an exotic fungi or not, but or fungus. There was a fungus associated with some of those wounds that was causing more damage in that area too.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Chris.
I just want to. It's very discouraging to listen to the sort of inevitability of some of these things, but I just wanted to sort of tell two sort of positive stories that have happened recently. And one is around the winter moth. and Joe Elkington's efforts to release parasitoids that have actually brought the winter moth outbreak. So winter moth was prevalent. I live in Falmouth, but it's been prevalent, in this region and out on to the vineyard. And I think David saw some examples a few years ago where the sort of the combination of defoliation with drought resulted in lots of oak death. And Joe Elkington published this paper in 2021 arguing that this has been an extremely successful biocontrol, and winter moth has kind of fallen off the table as one of those things to worry about. So positive story number one. Not that there's a biological control immediately on the horizon for the things we've been talking about, but it can be a tool. The other thing is that this issue of mycorrhizae, and that since the Clean Air Act amendments of the 1990s, that the amount of nitrogen and deposition and sulfur deposition in the Northeast has fallen by more than half. So the level of stress on our forests, from acid rain has gone down quite dramatically. And that's another story. So there are things that sort of over long timescales can be done to reduce these multiple stresses. And it's not, there's some positive stories out there.
Great, thank you, Chris. Let's go Julia and then Tristan.
Hi, this has been fascinating, and thank you very much for putting it together. I just was intrigued. David Foster said we're overdue for a major hurricane, and honestly, I think we're overdue for a major forest fire too. And maybe it would be good to have another similar gathering to talk about, what should be done in order to make the forest fire risk, reduced. I don't want us to have a situation like they did in Hawaii where, everybody's looking at the, government agencies and saying, wait a minute, you didn't do anything. Why weren't you doing the maintenance that you needed to do? Why weren't you doing the public outreach that you needed to do in order to really prepare for, what was obviously and inevitably going to happen? I'm the chair of the climate committee in Edgartown, and, I know the prevailing winds are southwest. So if there are embers, flying out from the state forest, they're going to fly to Edgartown, but the whole island is at risk here. We need to think about forest fire. I really believe that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Julia. We'll go Tristan and Liz and then David. And if anybody wants to jump in, Kenny, those, just raise your hand and we'll cycle you in. Go ahead, Tristan.
Thank you, everybody. This has been great to listen. Just, I guess, a question and comment. I'm in the woods every day, and the incredible diversity of plants, animals, learning about mushrooms, and I'm just a layman, not a scientist. And it is an incredible resource. And I also, P.S., think that we need to not only protect our public lands, but incentivize those areas of forests that are on private lands and private homeowners and contiguous neighborhoods. My question, I guess, comment and question, I do notice a proliferation, at least, of white pines. And I guess I'm going to ask some of the experts about that and what is their long-term prognosis. And then second of all, maybe to comment, I am a landscaper. I work in the brush for many, many years, and this island has changed entirely. I see things like wineberries supplanting blackberries and raspberries. I see, and my question also is, I see huge stands now, especially in parts of Tisbury, of Russian olives, which maybe that's not a bad thing. I don't know, but they certainly, it has changed dramatically in the 45 years or whatever it is that I've been working outside. And I guess I do want to ask about Russian olives and about white pines and maybe some of the experts' opinions about those things.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. We haven't touched on invasives or emerging species yet, so that's a good point to pick up on. We'll go Liz, David, Karen, and then to Chris. Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, hi, thanks. And I just wanted to thank Dan for setting up this meeting. It was really a good turnout too. Getting back to sort of what Julia was talking about, I noticed that David also said at the beginning of the meeting that land use is the biggest vineyard threat and that we are due or overdue for a major hurricane. And it seems to me that we have an opportunity before that happens, hopefully, to for the towns and the island to address where and how we want to rebuild after a hurricane or another extreme event in terms of protecting both the coastal areas and the forested areas and areas around the forest. So just some food for thought.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. David.
Great, thanks. Couple of really quick points. I like the idea of looking to actual plantations to be managed to convert them to more natural stands that was suggested. And oftentimes these do have native species in the understory. And that was a major recommendation of the 1999 report that Glenn Motzkin and I wrote on the state forest. Although the state forest is largely dominated by natural stands. There are significant plantations, but that's not the predominant condition out there. Secondly, the one thing that New England misses in its forests and Martha's Vineyard misses in its forests is really old forests that are operating naturally, that are of multiple ages, and that has a significant amount of kind of fallen dead trees in them. Some of the stands on the vineyard are just reaching the point where they're going into that kind of transition. And so the interesting thing about these ancient pitch pine forests, the old pitch pine forests, and if you go to a place like Ripley's Preserve, you will see this, where the big trees are falling and where they're being blown down, where there are openings and gaps created. Interestingly enough, pitch pine is regenerating. So we don't have many examples of old growth pitch pine forest. We don't have many examples of old growth forest at all in New England. So allowing that to develop would be a very important kind of natural process and give real opportunity on the vineyard. And then finally, two quick points. White pine and spruce are non-native. They are extensively planted. They are spreading very rapidly. And if you drive down the Edgartown West Tisbury Road, you'll see great examples of white pine spreading from plantations across the road into the Pahoganut part of the state forest. And that's just one example of what's happening everywhere on the island. Those two groups of species, because there are multiple spruces and white pine, are destined to become much more important because they do so well. We should have a forum on fire. I would love to participate in that. All of the evidence suggests that New England, even Martha's Vineyard, does not naturally burn anywhere near as much as it has in the recent history. And there are lots of statistics showing a huge decrease in the extent of area burned on the vineyard and burned across New England in the last 50 years, and a number of great papers that have been written on that. That doesn't mean that fire can't be important. It's just that the more that we manage for older forests, this mixed forest with hardwoods, and the less amount of open land, recently managed land, shrubby land, grassland, those are the really flammable fuel types that are out there, the better we will be. And then finally, I think it's very interesting. Beech leaf disease is still an unknown, but it could decimate beech across the island. 5 years ago, well, 10 years ago, when I was writing the book that I wrote about the island, I said the future of these forests are these white pines that are spreading, the spruce that are spreading, and beech, because it does so effectively and it was so abundant originally. It now is likely to be decimated by this disease or by this nematode. And the interesting thing is it's happening so quickly and it's so pervasively, and there's essentially nothing to be done, that our attitude is to stand back and just allow it to happen. Southern pine beetle is happening at a slower rate. So there is something kind of to be done. And so we are talking about moving very actively. I think contrasting and continuing to talk about those two and to say, well, why are we moving fast in one and why are we doing nothing on the other, allows us some real opportunity for thinking through long-term what we do on the other. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, David. Karen, and I'm not going to try to pronounce your last name, but maybe you could give us your last name for everyone.
Sure, I'm Karen Caljo. I'm the prescribed fire manager for Mass Wildlife, and this has been a great forum. It's been very informative, and I appreciate everyone, their input, and also for inviting me to listen in. I will save most of my comments related to historic and current fire for the topic for future topics, because that's quite an extensive topic. And I do believe and know there's documentation for pre-European fire and post-European fire on Martha's Vineyard, and we can save that for a different discussion. I do want to ask a couple of questions related to, and this may be more directed to Kevin. Are there lessons learned from pine beetle outbreaks associated with the New Jersey pine barrens as well as Long Island that we can use as sort of reference in understanding how those outbreaks occur and what we may expect in an island setting where, you know, natural processes not in play as great or the landscape isn't as large to really adjust to an outbreak from a very aggressive beetle like the southern pine beetle.
Thank you, Karen.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's a great question. And I think, so our field office does not cover New Jersey. I'm familiar with, you know, what occurred there. And that was kind of seen, southern pine beetle historically had been in New Jersey. Some people view it as the first expansion, but it was really just an expansion of damage. And I think the key with New Jersey and now Long Island is how persistent the damage has been, you know. So in the South, you have populations that bounce around. So, you know, in an area of the size of New Jersey, you may have, or of the pitch pine resource in New Jersey, you may not see outbreaks for, you know, 10 or 15 years. New Jersey was effectively, you know, almost a 20-year outbreak. Long Island has been now a 10-year outbreak. So, you know, consistent high levels of damage, you know, once the beetle arrived, it keeps going because we're not getting those winter temperatures. So yeah, my concern on the islands and it's kind of what I was trying to get at a little bit with pitch pine, or I'm sorry, on Long Island is, you know, once you have the beetle there and there's habitat, unless we really have the winters, we're not going to see, you know, we're going to just continue to see damage. You know, once it runs out of resources, then things can change. There are predators, but those, you know, there's a lag, and the beetles or the predators have never been demonstrated to, you know, be the regulating, you know, population regulator that winter temperatures have been. So yeah, I think, you know, when you have it in a more confined space, you're going to see much more damage in those at-risk stands.
Thanks, Kevin. Chris.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's great in the chat. You're going to have another forum on fire, and I'm happy to weigh in on that, especially as it affects sort of the grassland, shrubland end of things, because I think it is potentially an important tool for maintaining these small but very high biodiversity habitats. But I wanted to just one other point that we haven't talked about very much, and that is, you know, as David said in his first opening remark, was that, you know, land use change is the biggest threat, and the habitat that's expanded the greatest is suburban land use. And I just want to I see Luann Johnson and Rich Kaus on this forum. And I just want to say that they're doing some extremely interesting work with their Natural Neighbors program, encouraging people to think about how to naturalize their, the house lots, the residential lots that they own. And collectively, it's a very big area that could contribute to all the goals we've been talking about. That is, contributing to older growth forests, suburban areas, urban areas across the country have lots of people. There's lots of big trees. There's lots of carbon stored. There's almost an old growth. It's a very different kind of way of thinking about old growth, but values that can accrue from naturalizing residential lands. And I think the vineyard is at the forefront of some of those efforts, and it just needs to play into the way we think about the entire landscape.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a really insightful point, and that we live very close on the vineyard, different than the mainland in relationship to the forests, even the natural forests. They're not very far from our suburban and urban landscapes. Liz and then Sakiko.
Yeah, this is a perfect opportunity for me to mention the Climate Action Fair on Sunday, May 19th from 12 to 4 at the Agricultural Hall. We're going to have a panel on wildfire protection. There's going to be 2 panels on resilient landscapes, and there's going to be Maggie's going to give a biochar demonstration. So I hope you can attend and take part in that.
Great, thank you, Liz. Sakiko, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much for organizing this talk. My question is for Adam. So it seems like there are sort of different ways to approach it, how the forest should be. And then David mentioned this, and then so did Ben, so did Kevin. What kind of forest do you want? And I was curious, when you're making a decision about what to do with the southern pine beetles, what was the vision did you have? And then I was curious, like, what was the sort of time period in which you were thinking of how the forest should be? And what kind of people were involved in that sort of decision-making conversation?
Sure, that's a great question. So the time period, I'm thinking of a short-term time frame and a long-term time frame at the same time. With respect to short-term, if we're doing inventories of these 4 properties I mentioned, and then others, that means measuring the trees and measuring plots, and then writing a forest management plan on the basis of that. Based on what I've seen, if I'd like to thin forests of pitch pine stands in these properties within the next year or 2. I think what's happening with the southern pine beetle is, from what I can see, it's landed on the western shore. We call it the North Shore of Martha's Vineyard, but a western shore, and it's going to work its way east. The same thing has happened in Nantucket. It landed on the western part of Nantucket, and I think it'll work its way east. So I'd like, within the next couple of years, starting in the western parts and moving east, to do some thinnings of these forests. And I see over the long term, our goal is to help sustain pitch pine as a component of the forest that will be there. So we're trying to perpetuate it, and that means a little disturbance, not a little, sometimes a lot, where it can have some sunlight on bare soil, which is what it needs to regenerate. It doesn't always need a lot. Sometimes just a little opening is enough, and there's a little bare patch, and you'll see seedlings growing. But it does, if we're going to preserve some of the mature pitch pines that we admire, and you see that West Chop Woods is probably the best example of the properties we talked about today. I would say thin out the ones that are next to them, because the way these beetles move is they communicate chemically and just move from one tree to the next based on chemical signals they emit. There are 2 infestations of southern pine beetle at West Chop Woods right now. So we cut one down last week. It was like 2 trees. And next week, we're going to cut another 3-tree infestation down right away to get those beetles on the ground. And so you should know we're keeping an eye on it. But in terms of more work than that, I think we'll finish the inventory. And if we're going to do more work, it'll do it next year. Who reviews it? DCR. So what I'm writing is a forest stewardship plan. It gets reviewed by DCR, by our service forester, Jim Rossman, covers southeastern Massachusetts. We're setting him a lot of business. It also gets reviewed by Natural Heritage. Ali Shandi is the review biologist who reviews it, but it often goes to the director, Eve Rose. Forgive me, I'm mispronouncing her name. Eve will sometimes review them as well. And if there's specific actions that result in a cutting plan, those are also reviewed by Heritage and DCR. Back to the time frame, at 3 of these properties, West Chop Woods, Phillips Preserve, Caroline Tuttle, we put in permanent forest measurement plots. We're doing a baseline 10-year inventory, and we'll go back every 10 years. So this is for everyone here and everyone to come. They can learn, what did we do right and wrong right now? And then what happens over time. And so they're permanent plots. The data will be made available to the public. It's a resource for the MV Commission, and everyone comes after us. So hopefully, at least, we'll do something right by putting in the plots. What I mean by permanent, there's rebar rods, there's a GPS point. You can come back and check this 5 years next year, 100 years from now. And that's so ultimately everything should have a long-term time frame, even though we're doing some actions in the short term. So that's thank you, Sakiko.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Dave Celino, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Ben, and really good forum here. Thanks to all the speakers. And I'm Dave Celino. I'm the Chief Fire Warden of the State Fire Supervisor for DCR. And I wanted to sit back and listen in, and be remiss if with some of the fire risk talk if I didn't contribute some numbers for you off the state forester's official fire record. And I just happen to have it open here because I'm applying for some information requests for the vineyard, and so I thought I'd just throw some numbers out for folks on fire occurrence. And in the last 5 years, including 23, you had 44 wildfires documented on the vineyard. And they're all small. The largest fire out there was 2.25 acres. Most of them come in even under an acre, but the occurrence is 44 fire incidents. What I will tell you is that at least one of those 44 fires was proven to be a lightning strike, a natural fire. And most of our fires are human caused. In Massachusetts, we think that we're probably over 98% human caused. And this is really for you folks to think about, and I'm not going to judge it. I will tell you that in 2016, under severe drought conditions, we had a lightning strike fire on Joint Base Cape Cod, and that fire closed out at about 120 acres. They had roads on all 4 sides of the perimeter, and however, there was about 6 hours of quite a fight to keep that fire within its perimeter because we had battling winds, and so it was drought conditions. It burned significantly into the duff, and it burned for a little over 2 weeks before they were able to get full suppression on that fire. And I think that when you look at that, if there was no human intervention and no roads, there's a pretty good chance that fire would have burned through the year into snow, and that was a July fire. And so I think the question you have to ask is, we certainly have a long duration interval frequency on fire returning to the landscape in the northeastern forest. But there's no doubt that fire would have smoldered and then run on wind events and continue to make runs naturally, probably until snow, because of the significant drought conditions. It probably it wouldn't be surprising if it went over 20,000 acres, right? And so you have to ask, what about that lightning strike fire on Martha's Vineyard that we have? And that was in 2023, just before the rains came last year. So I think those are some of the questions you have to think about. And when you start talking about hazard and risk, unfortunately, it comes back on folks that own the values at risk out there, right? It's really subjective. You know, how do you weigh your risk out there? We can give you the data, the objective part of this, in terms of fuels and fire behavior, but really you have to sort of weigh out what your risk is. The Hawaii situation, I'm glad you brought up the Maui fire. That was one, and we had a fire in Massachusetts that kept me awake for about 30 days. And that could have been our Maui event, and that was in Rockport, Massachusetts. That was a little 20-acre fire. Had it come out of its perimeter on a wind alignment event, it would have taken out about 50 structures to the coastline. And so we got out of that one by the skin of our teeth. And then I would suggest that you look at history further back and look at some of the large fire events that we had. And yes, some of those, probably a lot of them, are human caused. So I just wanted to throw that out to the group. You know, there's a lot to think about. It's not an easy subject to try to sort out, but that's it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Great, thank you, David. I see Bob Woodruff raising his hand. If he can unmute, we'll give him, I think, the final word here before maybe some quick closing remarks.
How's that? Am I there?
Got it. Yep. Go ahead.
Awesome. I was also invisible, which is okay at my age to be for you all, before I finally woke up and punched the right button. Nice to see you here, Dave Salino, and get the statistics, Dave, for the last 5 years on the vineyard. Couple of things. One, I'm the chairman and founder of the Friends of Corellis, which works closely as a nonprofit with DCR and with Connor specifically to try to do things for the forest. And one of the things we did last summer prior to the Maui event was to put together what we're calling a wildfire management and sandplain restoration fund proposal. And in brief, that's a 1 or 2 page document that is before the commissioner of DCR right now. And Dave has been involved with Dan and others to bring this to the commissioner's attention. And we would love to have him respond to whether a privately run, and it could be run basically by DCR and the local fire chiefs under the aegis of the Martha's Vineyard Community Foundation, whether a fund supplementing state and federal funds for fire management and sandplain restoration, whether that makes any sense. The Friends would be delighted to sit down with the community foundation and make this happen. I think we could raise substantial amounts of money from the summer residential community on the vineyard to aid in something that is of great concern to everyone since the Maui event. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, Bob. Appreciate your efforts on that. And I've been talking to the commissioner's office about that very thing. So, so remember, folks, that on the fire issue, there's a lot of partners that come to the table. In our case, we can do a lot within the boundaries of the state forest, right? And we do a lot of mowing. We maintain fire breaks. We try to get over there and burn on our burn units when the weather allows us to. We can't do much about how we manage fuels outside the boundary of the state forest. And so what we do is we work with the chiefs and we work with those communities. Dodgers Hole is the latest example, doing Firewise assessments and really working with residents in terms of how they can manage their risk or their hazard around those values, those human values. However, we can't force them to do that, right? So the folks in Maui, in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, Paradise, California, they've all learned that. And even in Paradise, I will tell you that after that catastrophic event, there was not a lot of change in zoning regulations and zoning laws following that fire out there. There's a fair amount of resistance to
zoning regs and according to building materials and then even vegetation and landscaping.
Dave, question for you. Do you have any hope that the governor's imposition for against any forest management or forest clearing, whatever, i.e. the plantation removal of the 200 acres of white pine on the forest, whether that has any hope of happening in the next year or two? It's just very frustrating.
Yeah, I'm removed from that, Bob. I was a forester for many years, and I'm involved way over my eyebrows in fire management. So we sort of work with the results that we get on forest management practices out there, and where the system wants to implement fire as a tool, we're ready to go in a partnership, by the way, with looking at my friend Karen Caljo. And so it's a huge partnership that's out there between Fish and Wildlife and DCR and all the NGOs, especially those on the island, to try to get as many acres treated as we can for a number of different objectives, right? Hazard fuel reduction, restoration work, and everything in between. So.
Thank you, David. Unfortunately, we are running out of time for this, and I think we could continue for hours talking about this, and we've raised a number of points that need further exploration. So I think there's a whole list of things that the island, the MVC, and others can start working on. But I do want to appreciate the brain power and the interest levels on this call have been really encouraging. And I think if we're all putting our heads together and thinking about this and thinking about how do we protect our forests, how do we manage our forests, how do we live with our forests, how do our forests become more than the asset they already are for the island, we have a future that we can sort of craft, but we have to pay attention. We have to understand the changes that the climate is going to bring us. And we have to, imagine what are the best practices across an array of different opportunities and different challenges. So this conversation needs to continue. May 19th, as Liz said, the fire part of this will be delved into in a deeper way. But the forest management question, we haven't answered the question. I don't think we'll ever truly answer the question. But I think we put a lot of information on the table for everyone that's been listening. And I hope that conversation continues in different forums. The task force itself will think about what role it has and what role it can play, thinking about mapping exercises for the island and understanding our different forest systems and how do we protect them, how do we manage them, how do we approach them from the do nothing approach to the heavy management approach and everything in between. So thank you everyone that's been on this call. Thank you all of our speakers. Thank you all of the other experts that joined us to offer their expertise. Incredibly grateful for everybody's time. And so on that, thank you everyone. And we will see you guys on the next conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks much.